Testing 1 2 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 1 2 3. Here we go. Come on in. Hey, 'tis the season to give the perfect gift. C60 Evo organic oil elixirs and facial serum sets. And here with another sleep tip is our good pal, Chris Burrows, co-founder and chief scientist at C60 Evo. Hey, Chris, welcome back.
Richard, thank you so much for having me. My next tip regarding getting better sleep is related to electronic devices. So we all have these, a cell phone lying around, or we're using it on a regular basis. What a lot of people don't realize is that those devices give off blue light. That blue light is actually tells our bodies, the only time naturally that we see blue light is at the peak of the sun. So when the sun is up at its peak at noon. And so what those devices do, including your computer terminals, your cell phones, your tablets, is they convince our physiology that it's the middle of the day. You can imagine that if you're watching your cell phone or tablet at 10 p.m. and you've somehow convinced your physiology that it's the middle of the day, this is not good for sleep. So it's really important. Most devices have actually blue light blockers, and you can just go out and Google and how to blue light block on my Samsung device or Apple device, or even on your PC or your Mac. Make sure you turn that on. I know people who leave it on all day so that they're never impacted by that blue light. I would recommend 2 hours before the sun is setting in your local area to turn that on. Obviously it doesn't work if you're working on videos or you're working on pictures, but try and turn that on 2 hours early. And the other thing regarding electronic devices, try to keep them out of the bedroom. I recommend that you actually put a charging station outside of your bedroom so that you just don't even bring it in your bedroom. These devices, as we've kind of been reading and hearing, are like geared to trigger our endorphin responses, and so we like to be on them. They keep them up. So keep it out of the bedroom and make sure you got your blue light blocker on about 2 hours before the sun sets. And I always like sharing sleep tips, because our most consistent testimonial for our product is that people take it in the morning, they report mental focus and energy during the day, and then better sleep that night.
C60 Evo products deliver noticeable benefits to people and pets around the world. Immunity boost, deeper sleep, just like Chris said, more energy, mental balance, flexibility, and longevity. Please visit the website c60evo.com/Richard-Serrett. And don't forget, use the coupon code EVRS at checkout, EVRS at checkout, and then you save an extra 10%. That can't wait. All right, Chris, we'll talk again next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard Serrett's Strange Planet, following the truth wherever it leads, exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites, revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
From Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come warm yourself by the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Carlos Kajina is our technical producer, and Ryan White is our live stream producer. Be sure and check out the YouTube channel, Strange Planet, and the Rumble channel, Richard Serrett's Strange Planet. Before we get rolling, I want to acknowledge our Patreon Star Chamber donors, Tim Sullivan, Deep Paul, and the Harmonic Egg. Thank you so much, all of you, so much for your continued loyalty and support, and your monthly donation means a great deal. It makes a huge difference, and it helps me and Ryan continue to do what we do here. If you'd like to become a Patreon supporter, just go to patreon.com/Strange Planet. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. Pick the donor tier that's right for you. Of course, any amount is greatly appreciated. Coming up in the second half, former cattle rancher turned writer-researcher Julius Ruschel will be here. He's the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic, The Lies, the Gamble, and the COVID-Zero Con. And Julius will discuss the mysterious disappearance and then the reappearance of the flu. Remember that? Natural versus vaccine-induced immunity, the inability of the vaccines to control the virus, and other extraordinary lessons about the end of the pandemic. Also in hour two, David Redman is the former head of Alberta, Canada's Emergency Management Agency. He'll be here to explain how governments across Canada did the exact opposite of what they should have done in response to the pandemic. The exact opposite. He says it's nothing less than criminal negligence. This hour, U.S. constitutional lawyer Jonathan Emord returns to the program to discuss the massive trucker protests sweeping across Canada and, in fact, now around the world. We're going to explore the role of civil disobedience in a healthy Western liberal democracy. How do we know it's time to engage in civil disobedience? What are the limits of civil disobedience? What's the difference between civil disobedience and insurrection? Jonathan Emord has been practicing constitutional and administrative law before the federal courts and agencies since 1985. Having begun his career as an attorney in the Federal Communications Commission during the administration of President Ronald Reagan, Jonathan has maintained an abiding conviction to achieve full First Amendment protection for the freedom of speech and press. In 1991, he authored the critically acclaimed Freedom, Technology, and the First Amendment, in which he chronicled the intellectual foundations of the First Amendment and advocated replacing government control over the airwaves with a title registry, private property rights approach. He's the author of several books, including Global Censorship of Health Information, The Rise of Tyranny, Restore the Republic, and his latest, The Authoritarians. Jonathan Emord, welcome back to the program. How are you?
Just fine. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Let me get your overall impressions of the trucker protests that started in Canada. I guess they began, they rolled into Ottawa around the end of January, and it's just sort of taken off worldwide. What are your overall impressions? What stands out for you?
Well, I'm grateful. I think that this is just what happens when you deprive people of their individual liberty. They'll either go the way of people who are succumbing to totalitarianism around the world, which is just to cave in to those who wish to take their liberties away, or in the case of these strong Canadians, they refuse to have their rights taken away without standing up and at least protesting. And I think that their protests have been very effective, and I think it is in the long line of civil rights protests dating back to the 60s. It's their right that they're standing up for, their freedoms, and no one should be disparaging them for that, because it shouldn't be a one-sided environment in Canada where authority figures force the people to bend down and worship at the throne of this vaccine mandate or the vaccine passports, or limiting all of their rights to worship and to go to places to congregate or to eat, forcing them to form an allegiance, which is, they've transformed vaccination into a political event in which people have to endorse adherence to a state dogma that's driven more out of politics than it is out of science. It's been a mistake from the start. Coercion doesn't work. You've got to give people full information and allow them to decide what's in their own best interest and what's in the best interest of their families. And ironically, despite all of their efforts, the lockdowns have been a miserable failure, have not moved the mark at all against the virus. But what has changed the environment is the Omicron virus. The Omicron virus has succeeded because of its ability to block the Delta virus, the original virus, in causing a precipitous drop in the number of cases worldwide. And it's really the way out. It's sort of nature's vaccine, as Dr. Marty McCary puts it.
What is the role of civil disobedience? Why is it important to have that tool, I suppose, for citizens in a Western liberal democracy?
So with freedom comes the ever-present risk that those in government will abuse their power and take freedom away. So you can't just assume that freedom is whatever Parliament says it is. Freedom, you derive your liberties not from Parliament but from God. And those liberties are unalienable. And when the state trenches upon your rights, you have but few recourses. You can revolt in armed rebellion, and one would hope that that would be a very last resort, or you can do what is a tried and true method of protesting, and usually protest is considered your right as well. It's a freedom of speech and a freedom of assembly, which are deemed to be fundamental rights. And when you choose to do that, you're doing nothing more than exerting your sovereignty as citizens, proving that you are in political dissent from a movement by those in power who are ultimately answerable to you unless they wish to take over and assume totalitarian powers, which they're not lawfully able to do. So when Trudeau pounds his chest and stares down the Canadian public and stares down the truckers and says, back down, and I insist upon it, he's being foolish, politically foolish, because I think the long-term consequences of his unwillingness to compromise will be borne out ultimately in elections. But I believe that more fundamentally, he's showing himself to be an enemy of the people's liberties. And that's not a good place to be for a leader in a democracy. He's accountable to the people. He should be meeting with the truckers. He should be meeting with Canadian citizens who dissent. He shouldn't ignore them. He shouldn't hide from them. He shouldn't label them terrorists or fascists. He shouldn't try to use police to harm them or obstruct their protests. That's what he should be doing. Now, clearly, breaking the law is ordinarily something that one ought not to, and in the course even of a protest. However, when the law itself is unjust, when the law itself violates your liberties, then if you are following your rights, you would not abide by a law that violates your rights. If the state says you may not speak in dissent, the state has violated your freedom of speech. You can vindicate that right potentially through legal action in a court. But if there isn't time sufficient and the threat is imminent, you may have to do what Martin Luther King did, which is to engage in sit-down strikes, or to march in areas where they wouldn't allow people of color to march, or to drink from the whites-only soda fountain or bubbler. And that is a sign, yes, it is a violation of a law, but a law that is unjust, that violates the Constitution, that violates your rights.
Jonathan W. Emord is with us, the author of The Authoritarians, Emord.com, E-M-O-R-D, Emord.com. You mentioned, at the far end is armed insurrection, and of course, we hope that never happens. But, where is the line? Is there a line for peaceful civil disobedience? So, for example, when the truckers and their supporters were blocking the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor, over which about 25% of the goods that are traded between our two countries travels. And we're told that this was putting the auto sector in jeopardy, that the auto plants would have to shut down, and this was going to hurt people who had jobs in the auto sector and so forth. And I would argue, in order to be consistent, because I opposed, for example, protesters who were against the construction of pipelines in Canada. They were throwing burning tires onto railroad tracks. They were trying to block and impede the construction of certain infrastructure. And I opposed that. So to be consistent, I thought, well, perhaps they should allow people to travel on the Ambassador Bridge, allow that trade to go through. What are your thoughts on that? And what are the limits to civil disobedience?
Well, I do believe that it's preferable for the protesters to engage in lawful protest, and certainly by blocking the bridge completely, they are denying the use of a thoroughfare that's meant to be open to the public, and so they're violating law. However, their point in breaking the law, and now laws are oftentimes broken in when one engages in political dissent. And in this instance, people are fighting for their liberties, their individual freedom. And as a consequence, it's quite a different thing to stand up for your freedom against an unjust law being applied against you versus taking on, an industrial party because you object to pollution or some other thing that doesn't immediately affect your individual freedom. Having said that, there is, of course, a very easy solution to this problem, which is for Justin Trudeau to get rid of the vaccine mandates and get rid of the vaccine passports, and to work with the provinces to achieve that objective. It's against what he has argued for, but there is no sound justification for his position. And so while I sympathize greatly with the truckers, I agree with you that one ought to pursue a lawful course, mindful of two things. One is that it's not necessary, if it was indispensable for some reason that a law be broken in order to establish your position on rights, and I mentioned one where you have segregation in the 60s and 50s in the Jim Crow era in the South, and individuals of color would want to drink from the whites-only fountain or go use a whites-only bathroom or get on the whites-only segment of a train or a bus to establish the fundamental rights violation taking place. But they were also willing to be arrested and to suffer the consequences of the arrest, even in protest. So, yes, there are times when civil disobedience becomes necessary. Remember George Wallace standing in front of the school in Georgia, or was it Alabama? When the National Guard were called
Alabama, right?
Yeah, Alabama, to ensure that federal law would be followed. He was standing up for state law. Likewise, these truckers are really standing up for fundamental law, that is, their unalienable right to be free of this coercion and forced compliance. But I would say it's in their best interest not to block the bridge entirely. And likewise, I think they've decided to move out of the residential areas in Ontario, Ottawa and Ontario, around the Parliament, so that they can, the people who are in the neighborhoods can be at peace. And that is smart. That's a very smart move, because I think most Canadians, I'm speculating, but I think it's probably so, that most Canadians have sympathy with them at this point. I would certainly hope that is the case.
Oh, well, I would hope so as well. But according to the polls, if they're to be believed, that's always a question, up to 2/3 of Canadians actually would be in favor, Jonathan, of using the military to forcibly remove protesters. This breaks my heart. This fact, if this is in fact accurate, this poll, 2/3 of Canadians, part of me thinks this country's lost. What are your thoughts? When the overwhelming the population is against you in your endeavor to secure, they're even fighting for the rights of those people that are opposed to them. But when so many are in opposition to you, what does that say about a country and its future?
Well, if indeed it is true that an overwhelming majority of Canadians support the government's position and would have the military arrest the Freedom Convoy people, that's a very sad sign, because that means that coercion, force, and to eliminate political dissent is acceptable to most Canadians. What I would say then to that majority is that you had better beware that there will come a time when you have an interest individually that dissents from the majority, and you would like to have a place of safe harbor where the law would protect you in your dissent. But if you follow this course, you will ensure that your own rights are being violated, because it's not just the truckers' rights that you're taking away with this precedent. You're establishing that the state can overwhelm and override and use brute force against any in dissent. So it's a slippery slope they've created, if they believe in this, and they had better be careful, because there will come a time, as government continues to grow, because that's what they're asking be done, if they ask for the military to be used against the citizens of the country, not against a foreign adversary, there will come a time when that same military will be used against them. Because one thing's for certain, the truth is, the more power you give to the state and the less power you allow for individual discretion and dissent, the less freedom you have. And it continues on in that vein until there comes a point when, if you don't adhere to what is demanded, you will be punished. So it's not good to condemn others for the exercise of their freedoms. You should celebrate freedom universally, even if you disagree with those who are protesting. Their right to protest, their right to assemble, their right to freedom of religion, their right to attend the churches of their choices, their right to travel unmolested by the state. All of these things are fundamental rights. And when you give them up for whatever cause, and in this it's tragic that people would give it up for a virus, then you can't really have anyone to blame but yourself, because you didn't stand up for liberty.
Jonathan, got to take a quick time out. We'll come back and discuss further. Jonathan W. Emord, U.S. constitutional lawyer, emord.com, the website. The book is The Authoritarians. Back with more of our conversation right after these. Hey there, I'm hard at work on another edition of Inner Sanctum, my free monthly newsletter. Inner Sanctum features my monthly brief, a column of my thoughts and opinions on what's happening in the world. It features a spotlight on a past guest, a look ahead to an upcoming episode of my weekly syndicated radio program, The Conspiracy Show. It features a look at this month in conspiracy and UFO history, and my Conspiracy Unlimited podcast episode pick of the month, and so much more. To get your free monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum, delivered to your email inbox, just go to my website, strangeplanet.ca, strangeplanet.ca. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and click on Inner Sanctum and register. It's fast, easy, and again, absolutely free.
Poking holes in the darkness. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To see the light, call Richard now at 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
And we are back with Jonathan W. Emord, U.S. constitutional lawyer. The latest book is The Authoritarians, Emord, EMORD.com, Emord.com. We're talking about civil disobedience, the truckers' protest. In Canada, we have a Charter of Rights that was passed in 1982. I think it took effect officially in 1985, only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. To me, that's problematic because we have fundamental rights, but ultimately, if they can be overridden by a judge, what good are they? What are your thoughts? Is that section problematic?
You bet. And the reason it's problematic is because it's based on a false premise. When Thomas Jefferson defined liberty in the early days of the American Revolution, he said that liberty was freedom from restraint, and that it was beyond that to be limited only by another person's liberty, right of liberty, but not by the law, because he said the law is often the tyrant's weapon. And so it is in the United States that we have pre-political rights. Our rights are said to come from God in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and not from the state. The problem in Canada with the Charter of Rights is that it's a creature of Parliament, and so it is affected by law. To the extent Parliament wishes to constrain rights, it may use Section 1, and that, of course, is entirely unacceptable. The reason why it's unacceptable is that these rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and property, these rights are indeed pre-political. And you need not answer to a magistrate to exercise them. You need not achieve the assent of Parliament or any other authority to exercise them. They are your birthright. They come from God. This notion, which is embedded in Lockean philosophy in the second treatise on government, is revolutionary and formed the foundation for the principles that underlie the American Constitution. You lack that written Constitution, you lack that written Bill of Rights that recognizes the rights of man to be pre-political, that understands that you don't go to the state to get your rights. Your rights you have at birth, and they come from God. Now, the problem then is one of living in a world of second bests. How do you cope in a world that has not recognized your rights as fundamental birthrights that are unalienable, incapable of being taken away from you? Well, you must struggle. And you must struggle to change the law. But of course, it's a bigger issue to change the law to recognize these rights as pre-political particularly now in this late stage of development of the Canadian democracy. But if Canada wishes to have rights and have them be protected and not have them capable of being written away by any renegade, radical prime minister like Justin Trudeau comes down the pike, you have to make it impossible for that prime minister to be able to exercise such a broad blanket ability to affect a constriction of your rights. There will always be emergencies. Everything can be arguably defined into a state of emergency. Tyrants throughout history have used the argument of military necessity or an emergency to justify the deprivation of people's rights. Tyrants are born every day claiming that they have to exercise authoritarian control in order to protect the public from one alleged harm or another. This is just the latest variety of it. They've seized upon the virus as a justification for a gross expansion in state power, to the extent that people literally cower in fear about what will become of them if they transgress even the slightest rule on where they can travel, what vaccine passport has to be used to get into one facility or place of business or another, because of this type of environment. This is the way it is in Australia, or has been for some time in Australia as well. Is
this a particular function of parliamentary systems, well, as opposed to the American system, that in the parliamentary system and countries that live under such systems, we tend to place or put greater value on social responsibility, the rights of the collective versus the individual. When you hear in the media up here all the time, I find it rather disheartening, that we have to somehow balance our individual rights, or we have to give up our individual rights for the greater good. We have a state broadcaster here, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is now on social media calling the idea of freedom as a far-right concept. The Globe and Mail, the newspaper, said that freedom has been weaponized by the far right. I've never heard such nonsense, but this is the reality up here. But to my point about the parliamentary system, from the British Commonwealth, is this giving into the collective rights superseding the individual rights? Is this unique to the parliamentary system?
No, it's common among all socialist states. Collective rights are a myth. There is no such thing as a collective right. Rights are individual. You don't speak in unison with 50 other people or 100 other people on all the topics of interest to you. They're unique to you. Your freedom of speech is your right, unique to you. Likewise, your freedom of religion, your freedom of conscience, your freedom to travel. We don't travel as herds. We're not herd animals. We are individuals, and as a result, our rights must be individual. When you talk of collective rights, it's a myth. Rights don't arise from a collective. This notion of collective rights is a byproduct of socialism. It's a byproduct of Friedrich Hegel's conception of collectivism that arose in the early 19th century and presaged Marxism. It is an idea that merely justifies the exercise of state action in transgression of individual rights, because collective rights are ordinarily pitted against individual rights. This idea that society has an interest that is more important than your rights, and therefore your rights can be violated to ensure protection for the collective is nothing more than socialism. And what it results in is increasing levels of deprivation of freedom. It means that you are more of a slave than you are a sovereign. And in a just society where individual rights are protected, the individual is sovereign. Sovereign over his person. Sovereign over those things to which he has used the sweat of his brow and his labor to create something of value and property unique to himself. Jefferson said, "I am not a friend of a very energetic government. It is always oppressive. We should always have a wary eye about government. Government is nothing more than the use of force at the behest of those who are granted a license to engage in political decision-making. And that is a very dangerous thing. When you have a monopoly of force that you can exercise whenever you care to declare a public interest or collective right or collective end, then there is nothing left to the individual except that which the state allows."
Jonathan, pardon the interruption. Got to take another time out. We'll come back and discuss further. Jonathan W. Emord, author of The Authoritarians, emord.com, will also take questions from the live chat. And Ryan, my live stream producer, will collate them and I'll read them on the air. Back with more of my conversation with Jonathan right after these.
Question everything. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
I don't need to tell you how important building and sustaining a healthy immune system is these days. And just in time, my good friends at Get the Tea are offering a special package called the Immune Builder. You get 1 month's supply of Life Change Super Tea. That's 8 bags. 1 bottle of Bioastin. That's 75 capsules. Now, Bioastin, or astaxanthin, is known as one of nature's most powerful antioxidants and provides a wide range of impressive health benefits. The Immune Builder also includes 1 bottle of Potent C Wild Alaskan Sockeye Omegas. That's 90 gel caps. And 1 copy of the book Natural Astaxanthin, Hawaii's Super Nutrient by Dr. William Sears. There's so much more than tea at getthetea.com. Get your Immune Builder right now. Not available in any store. Use the code UNLIMITED and all your purchases ship for free. The Immune Builder from getthetea.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. We're now crossing a zone of turbulence. Please return your seats and food trays to their upright position and make sure your carry-on luggage is safely stowed. You're about to leave everything you know behind. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Strange Planet. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Follow Richard on Twitter at Richard Syrett. For show information, visit the website strangeplanet.ca.
Question everything. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Just a reminder, coming up in hour 2, Julius Ruschel. I call him the cowboy philosopher, former cattle rancher turned data researcher. He dives deep into the data, and he's the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic. And then, towards the tail end of the program, the former head of Alberta's Emergency Management Agency, David Redman, will be here to talk about how all of the provinces, all 10 of the provinces, all 3 of our territories had perfectly fine emergency response or emergency pandemic response plans in place before 2020. They get updated regularly. And they were all thrown out the window. In the panic, I suppose. And so now the response has been the exact opposite of what those pandemic plans recommended. David Redman, coming up in hour 2. Jonathan W. Emord stays with us, the author of The Authoritarians, and the website is emord.com. So, Jonathan, your Bill of Rights, you don't have that Section 1, that weenie clause that I mentioned earlier, that all of our rights and freedoms are subject to reasonable limits. That's Section 1 of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You don't have a Section 1, and yet still there are many occasions where, through the pandemic, inalienable rights have been infringed upon, and the courts have ruled that those infringements were justified. So what good is a charter or a Bill of Rights in this case?
Well, that's a very good point. We have raging socialism in the United States. We have people like AOC and Bernie Sanders, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, who are advocates of this collectivism we've been talking about. And they do just what Justin Trudeau has done. While they seem to have a liberal tolerance for mass destruction by BLM and Antifa, and even align themselves with BLM, despite its destructive activities and its movement towards socialism in education and its rather callous disregard for actual losses suffered by individual black people in this country and in Canada. He nevertheless, Justin Trudeau, aligns himself with them, and he ignores their destruction. He doesn't bring down the threat of use of military force against them, even though they caused mass destruction, certainly across the United States, for over a year, and continuing in city after city, burning, looting, murder, and in Canada to some degree as well, and with Canadian churches being desecrated, and churches and religious centers throughout the United States being damaged and desecrated. So there is a threat and a movement afoot, not just in Canada, but in the United States, of course, as well, where rights are being violated, where courts are not protecting rights, where individuals are getting away with literally murder, where this whole movement to let criminals go free, unchecked by the law. And yet notice the hypocrisy here. Notice how the liberal media in the United States attacks the Freedom Convoy, and likewise in Canada, and how the state takes the view that these peaceful people, overwhelmingly peaceful, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single instance of any organized violence like you had with BLM and Antifa riots all across the nation, and in Canada, too. And yet, the state was quite tolerant there and is utterly intolerant of the Freedom Convoy, mouthing platitudes about protecting freedom of speech, but looking for every alternative to declare anything they do unlawful, depriving them of fuel, trying to make it difficult for them to survive, cutting off access to goods and services, denying people the right to supply them, this sort of thing. They never would have thought to do in a million years to the racist protesters and the advocates of socialism. Isn't that interesting?
Well, we have the counter-protest now in Ottawa and elsewhere. These are people, I guess, who are protesting freedom protesting getting rid of mask mandates, getting rid of vaccine passports. They're in favor of those things. Never mind that they're free to continue to, cower in their basement and wear their mask 24/7, but that's not good. They want to protest. And now we're seeing in these protests a really ugly, vindictive side. We're seeing people holding up signs saying, gas the vaccinated or the unvaccinated, gas the unvaccinated, kill the unvaccinated. We are seeing at these protests the hammer and sickle, the flag, of communism, which has killed 100 million people in the 20th century. And of course, this is all being totally ignored by the mainstream media. Now, they found, one agent provocateur waving a Confederate flag up in Ottawa, which has no historical context whatsoever. And there was one agent provocateur waving a Nazi flag, and it was called out, of course, by the truckers. But now we have these gas the unvaccinated, kill the unvaccinated, and hammer and sickle flags everywhere. The mainstream media says absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it's really tragic to see this groupthink in the media, where dissent again is not allowed. Cancel culture rages on, and that's most unfortunate. While these people who are protesting in favor of Marxism, communism, and intolerance of dissent are enemies of liberty, it is precisely because we love liberty that we protect their right to protest. And that is the true sign of someone who believes in individual liberty, that they would allow even the opinions that they hate to be communicated to ensure that the law provides equal protection. This gets back to what we talked about earlier, when those who are advocating denying the Freedom Convoy their rights and using the military against them are on the slippery slope. But
okay, Jonathan, sorry, this was a short segment. We've got to take one final time out, come back. We'll get to some questions from our live stream. Jonathan Emord of the...
As you're staring up at the night sky, ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. The truth goes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
U.S. constitutional lawyer Jonathan W. Emord is with us. The Authoritarians. How do we get a copy, Jonathan?
Amazon or Walmart.com, Target.com, but most people get it from Amazon.
And for my Canadian listeners, what would you say to them if they say, well, that's an American perspective? What would you say?
No, I'm an advocate of individual liberty. While I'm very much an American, I believe to my core in the principle of individual liberty articulated in the second treatise on government by John Locke, who was a servant of the crown, of course. Never came to fruition in England, never came to fruition in Canada, but did come to fruition in our country here in the United States. And that is a great recourse. I would hope that someday every nation of the world could benefit from that recognition that we are sovereign, we are born free, our rights must be respected by the state is our servant, not our master. And it just offends me to my core to see my brethren in Canada, many of whom are related to me. My relatives actually were from Ottawa, and they came across into the United States from there on my father's side. But I just, even were that not the case, Canada is a great free state, a great ally in the fight for liberty. But right now it's discrediting itself, as is Joe Biden, discrediting our own country in the United States by adhering to this socialist agenda, collectivism, and denying individual rights to dissent. You know, there's an alternative to this that people don't recognize, and they ought to take it very seriously. And that alternative is to recognize the doctor-patient relationship, the individual rights of each person, allowing people to fully informed to exercise their individual choice, to choose what's best for them and their own families. We can't substitute for that a collective approach, a one-size-fits-all, get a vaccine or die approach, because it simply is grossly insufficient. The vaccines are not perfect. They're not the solution to this problem. Ultimately, we have to rely on treatments. There's going to be vaccine fatigue. No doubt it's already setting in. There are only so many jabs a person is going to want to accept in a lifetime, particularly if they get sick from the shot, or if they feel uncomfortable with pain resulting from the shot, or if there are alternatives, and there are treatment alternatives. Early treatment is the most important thing to deal with this.
Right,
we have wholesome immunity coming out of the Omicron, but we still need treatment available everywhere. And what these nations, both the United States and Canada, have done is they have made it so difficult to get access to treatments because they want to maximize the percentage of people being vaccinated, even though the vaccine wanes within 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, I have a bad feeling, Jonathan, that part of this is they want to eliminate the control group. I know that's sinister, but I'm left with very few alternatives at this point. I want to get to the live stream questions here. You Betcha asks, Jonathan, how do we balance people's right to protest and people in downtown Ottawa not to have to listen to honking horns all day? Yeah,
there are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on protest that should be recognized. In other words, you have rights as a citizen who lives in your home in Ottawa, and you have a right to peaceful existence in your home that can't be violated. And so there can be reasonable restrictions that protect your rights as a homeowner, and there should be.
Yeah, I think the truckers have done a pretty good job in terms of self-policing with that. Momzilla asks, wants to know whether I would lead a freedom party in Canada or Ontario. Well, we already have those options. I think we have the People's Party that are running federally, and here in Ontario we have the New Blue Party. Let's see, Phil Minervino asks, what role do the big banks play in government? I'm not sure exactly what Phil means, but Jonathan, do you want to talk about the role of big banks in government?
Well, we have this unfortunate thing in the United States called the Federal Reserve System, and you likewise have a centralized system of banking in Canada. And it's a long story that we probably can't take this show to address because the topic is different, but suffice it to say that corruption prevails in this unity between banking and government, and it has resulted in very severe restrictions on competition in banking and in competition in currency, and that has been to the great detriment of individuals and to freedom. So it's another big problem that needs to be addressed.
We have a number of politicians, including the Prime Minister, including one of the leaders of the opposition, the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, the federal finance minister, a number of premiers who all seem to have sworn allegiance to the World Economic Forum. Do you think that if you are the leader of a country or of a province, that you should be disqualified from running if you are a member of the World Economic Forum?
I do believe that unions of that sort are greatly to the disadvantage of people within their own nations, whether it's in the United States or in Canada. We need to be, nationalism is real and is important. Canada is a nation with people who are necessarily similar in their much closer in their wants, needs, and interests than, say, they would be to people in Africa or France or somewhere else. And I mean this in the sense that you have an interest in protecting the resources of Canada and ensuring that your customs and traditions are protected to the extent that it defines free options for your people and defines who you are as people in the world. This idea of trying to give to international bodies control over your nation is a very bad idea. I favored Brexit, for example. The ruination that comes when a party that is distant from your shores can decide for you what your economy will do or what an individual business can do in your country is outrageous deprivation of sovereignty and political control. It destroys democracy in your country.
Do you, very quickly, Jonathan, I've just got about 30 seconds here, but do you think that this trucker protest that is now going worldwide, is this the beginning of something, an unstoppable movement towards populism, perhaps a new nationalism?
I think it is unstoppable. I think it is a movement for individual liberty, and I'm delighted to see it. I was becoming quite less sanguine about the prospects for rising up against totalitarianism, collectivism, socialism, but not now that I've seen the truckers. And I believe it is an international movement. We're already seeing it all over. It'll be happening in the United States soon.
Jonathan, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome. Great to be with you.
Emord.com, emord.com. Get a copy of The Authoritarians, available at Amazon. All right, when we come back, the cowboy philosopher, former cattle rancher turned COVID data researcher, and the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic, Julius Ruschel, will be here, and later, the former director of Alberta's Emergency Management Agency, David Redman. Back with more after these. Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Carlos Cagina is the technical producer. Ryan White is the live stream producer. Check out my YouTube channel, Strange Planet, and my Rumble channel, Richard Serrett's Strange Planet. Later this hour, I'll speak with the former head of Alberta's Emergency Management Agency, who will explain how governments across Canada did the exact opposite of what they were supposed to do in response to the pandemic. He calls it criminal negligence. David Redman will be here. He's worked with all orders of government and extensively with the private sector to develop emergency management in Alberta, Canada, and North America. And prior to his work with EMA, he had a 27-year career as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. So you'll want to be listening a little bit later this hour when Dave Redman joins me. While only rarely discussed and frequently dismissed as a mere curiosity, the mystery of the disappearing flu is actually one of the most important events of the past 2 years. Unpacking this mystery provides deep insights into the future trajectory of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, exposes the abject failure of the vaccines to control the pandemic, and puts the final nail in the coffin on futile public health measures like masks and social distancing. Get ready for more than a few surprises as you follow me on another deep dive into COVID mayhem. Julius Ruschel is the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic, The Lies, the Gamble, and the COVID Zero Con, and this new investigative report, The False God of Central Planning, the mysterious reappearance of the flu, natural versus vaccine-induced immunity, the inability of the vaccines to control the virus, and other extraordinary lessons about the end of the pandemic. Julius, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
Great. It's a lengthy title, but very insightful. All right, so let's begin. What did happen to the seasonal flu these last 2 years?
Well, that's one of the remarkable things about it is that I think it was around March is that it essentially just completely disappeared all around the world. And I mean, there's been lots of speculation as to whether it's whether the flu has been relabeled as COVID, but the actual flu tests continued without stopping. It's just that they all came back negative. And so, but there's a phenomenon in virology that's called viral displacement or viral interference, where when you have an infection with one virus, that it essentially blocks infections with other viruses. And so that seems to be playing a huge role because it is a fairly new, it's a novel virus. So our immune systems aren't used to this thing. So it's had such a huge outsized effect on our immune systems on so many people that viral interference effect has essentially, squeezed out the ability for all of these other viruses that are usually part of seasonal flu season to infect us. And
why is that important then?
Okay, so it's important because, well, as you mentioned in your introduction, I mean, one of the things that it shows is that like the masks and all of those things are not actually responsible for the disappearance of the flu, because the flu disappeared around the 30th of March. And here in Canada, the first mask recommendation didn't come in until the 20th of May. And it didn't become mandatory until I think the 18th of July. So when the health authorities are taking responsibility for that, that's not what's causing it. It's viral interference that caused that. But what's interesting is when you start going through all of the different countries, you can see now that the flu is starting to come back. And that shows you when the natural antibodies that from exposure are reaching a level where the flu is no longer, where COVID is no longer able to have such a strong effect on our immune systems. And that's what allows the flu then to come back into to start to circulate. So in countries that have high natural immunity, like Sweden, like South Africa, like Brazil, India, they've all got the flu back, whereas in Canada, it's not. And they're all reaching it, like once they cross around, 60, 70, 80% of the population that has some kind of antibodies to COVID, that's when the flu comes back. And in many of those places, it's before they've even reached any kind of high level of vaccination. Like in Sweden, deaths essentially plateaued somewhere around, I believe it was, when did I write down here? I think it was early last spring, March last year, and they've essentially stayed fairly flat ever since, because that's the point where they had the high natural immunity, and now the flu is back there.
And why do those countries you mentioned, Sweden, Brazil, South Africa, India, why do they, I think you mentioned Brazil, correct me if I'm wrong, why right. do they have natural immunity?
Well, the virus has been able to circulate so freely there, like the COVID virus has been able to circulate so freely that everybody has essentially been exposed to it. I mean, this is one of the big... the silly parts of this whole COVID debacle is everybody looks at COVID cases based on PCR tests. But when you actually do antibody tests to see who has antibodies, the vast majority of people in these countries already have been exposed to this and developed antibodies without ever developing any kind of symptoms and without going and getting a PCR test.
And South Africa had relatively low vaccine uptake, as I recall.
That's right, yeah.
Julius Reuschel is the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic, The Lies, the Gamble, and the COVID Zero Con. He's also the author of a new investigative report titled The False God of Central Planning. Why do you call it the God of Central Planning? The false God. Sorry, the false God of Central Planning.
Because again, the government has essentially stepped in and claimed to be able to manage this entire pandemic and everything that surrounds it, and yet, looking through, for example, with the flu disappearance and all of these different parts that have featured in this piece, the government essentially has been irrelevant to managing this pandemic, and that the countries that are actually now faring very well, like a country like Sweden, they've essentially pulled through it without doing any of these control measures that have tried to, control every single step of what we're allowed and not allowed to do. And yet, the flu has essentially come back because the virus has already moved through the population, and their death rates are no different than neighboring countries like Germany that try to control everything.
So if I'm understanding this, Julius, and correct me if I'm wrong, the disappearance of the flu and then the reappearance of the flu is kind of a harbinger. So explain again the lesson here of the reappearance of the flu.
Okay, so the reappearance of the flu is essentially signaling that the COVID virus is no longer able to displace these other seasonal viruses. So it's no longer having this outsized effect on our immune system that's able to block infections with these other things. So like, for example, in Sweden, the only difference between Sweden and Germany is that, you know, they have the same variants, they have the same vaccination rates, all of those things. But the difference is that the virus is able to circulate freely. And so in Sweden, the flu is now back, and deaths from COVID are essentially flat compared to a country like Germany, where they've had much higher deaths still, and they don't have the high immunity. And the flu is not back in Germany.
And the flu returned to Sweden because the Omicron virus is so mild it can no longer displace the flu. Is that the idea?
It's actually something different because, for example, Delta also moved through Sweden and Germany at the same time. And so in Germany, Delta was fairly deadly, and in Sweden, it was not. So the main difference between the two of them was that Sweden had the high natural immunity because the virus had already circulated so much. Right. And so that's where the difference here is not just that Omicron is milder, but that countries that have, you know, high natural immunity, sure, they can still get infected, but it's not going to land people in the hospital or in a grave nearly as easily.
OK, so what's happening in Canada? You call it a test case for Omicron.
Yes, because Canada was one of the first countries where you've got a high vaccinated population that was exposed to Omicron, because like in Sweden and Germany, it was still Delta when Omicron was arriving in other places. So, you know, here we've got a situation where, you know, is Omicron mild, or is Omicron mild like in South Africa because they have natural immunity? Because our natural immunity is very, very low because of our strict measures in Canada. So Omicron arrived here, and we've seen, like, I mean, yes, the hospital rates have gone up and so have deaths, but not in a very large amount considering the huge scale of people that are now getting infected with this thing. And we're also seeing that a lot of the folks that are being infected, like the statistics that are coming out of the hospitals and all of that, it's not necessarily that they're in hospital with COVID. They're actually there, and then they have a PCR test that's positive. I think Ontario said 50% of their hospitalizations are actually incidental. They were admitted to be treated for something else and then had a positive PCR test. So it's kind of showing, thankfully, that Omicron is mild even in populations like ours that haven't had much exposure, and not just like in South Africa or Sweden that have.
Julius, I mean, unless I'm missing something from your bio, you're not an immunologist or a virologist. You're a cattle rancher. You're an author. How is it that you were able to make this observation? I'm not reading this anywhere else.
I started writing about all this COVID stuff in the spring. Like, I had a website where I was teaching some cattle farming practices. And so I'm used to dipping into all of this kind of stuff. I have a background in geology, so I understand statistics and that sort of stuff. And so I've just been digging into the raw data. I'm looking at the government's raw data here. I'm not pulling any of these statistics off of anything else other than what's purely official put out by the statistics departments, but which is at odds with what the public health officials are saying in the media.
Now, when we're talking about COVID, you say, new virus, but same role it's playing, particularly with the elderly. We used to call pneumonia an old person's best friend because it would take them quickly and, usually painlessly.
That's right.
So talk to me more about the COVID's role, old role as the old man's friend.
If you look at in Canada, the year-over-year all-cause mortality, the number of folks that have passed away is essentially the same. And so what you see then from that is that essentially the same people that would have been dying normally from influenza and other seasonal viruses in the winter are now dying from COVID. So COVID has essentially pushed out the flu and is playing that exact same role of getting people that are in nursing homes or that are near the end of their life or have extreme vulnerabilities because of pre-existing conditions. And I mean, we see that very clearly in the epidemiology data. There's something like 1,000-fold difference in risk between somebody that's young and healthy versus somebody that's living in an old folks home, right? So just like influenza, the folks that are at risk from this thing are the folks that are already at risk from influenza and other seasonal viruses. They're folks that have immune systems that are weak and essentially shutting down at the end of life.
Right. And we finally, after 2 years, had the director of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky, hide out on a Sunday chat show where nobody watches to finally admit that up to 75% of all COVID deaths in the United States were with COVID and up to 4 serious comorbidities. Julius will take one final time out and come back and discuss further. Julius Ruschel is the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic, The Lies, the Gamble, and the COVID Zero Con. How can people read the full report?
If they come to my website at www.juliusruschel.com, everything is there.
All right, and we'll spell it. It's Julius, and then Ruschel is Ruechel. Ruechel. JuliusRuschel.com. One of the big mistakes that was made, you say, is totally underestimating how many people were exposed to SARS-CoV-2. You give the example, actually, of white-tailed deer in the state of Iowa. Explain.
It's extraordinary, actually, that the last winter, I guess through the various hunters and whatnot that were harvesting deer, they started doing PCR tests to kind of get a survey of what the deer population, how many of them had been exposed to COVID. And 80% of them already had exposure during that one winter. I mean, it really shows you how quickly this virus will, spread through an entire population. And yet the forests there were not filled with coughing and dying deer. So again, the vast majority of them are just fine and were probably asymptomatic, but now have antibodies and had some kind of exposure.
Okay. And so because our public health officials and politicians were unable to sort of appreciate this point, how quickly it spreads, what's the takeaway then?
The takeaway is that, what should have happened last year, like in 2020, or not last year, but 2 years ago, is that the vulnerable population should have been advised to voluntarily isolate themselves for the first big wave that came through, and allowed the rest of us who are not going to be likely to have any kind of severe outcomes to be exposed to this thing, have our, asymptomatic or mild flu that, it's playing the same role of a seasonal flu, or similar to a seasonal flu virus. And then most people would have had antibodies, and that would have starved the virus of hosts so that the vulnerable would have been able to get back to their lives and not have to worry about sheltering and hiding away. But instead, they've essentially been, trapped away from society at risk for 2 years because the rest of us were not able to get exposed to this thing.
In other words, they did everything wrong.
Exactly. And I mean, the idea of waiting for these vaccines has been insane because, as I said, it made everybody have to wait for 2 years that's vulnerable. And as we're seeing now, the vaccines are actually not what's causing look at, Germany versus Sweden, where Germany is had high issues with the Delta virus despite high vaccination rates. And Sweden, which had high natural immunity, had no more dying anymore because they allowed the virus to circulate freely. So the idea of this vaccine being the savior, the exit out of this whole entire disaster, has been actually the cause of a huge amount of unnecessary suffering and hasn't achieved anything.
Well, here's the frustrating part, Julius, and the tragic part is all of the 10 provinces and 3 territories, they had a pandemic emergency pandemic plan in place, and all of them, every single province and every territory, through those perfectly good plans, which talk about things like focus protection. They talk about, protecting the vulnerable, but maintaining societal cohesion and keeping things open and keeping the economy open. They were thrown out the window. Why do you suppose they did that?
I think it began with a hysteria that everybody just absolutely panicked and threw out. I mean, at the heart of this is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that when you have individual autonomy, that provides a hard limit on how far the government can go in a panic situation. That should have been the last check and balance. This is, well, you can recommend things to us, but you can't take away our rights. Because the moment that you do that, you stop the discussion that would have been able to solve this, to sort of diffuse the panic and get people from different points of view to be able to speak about things. Instead, that was tossed out the window, and there's this entire there's kind of an idea that's been growing more and more that the government is meant to manage everything in all of life. And they've, they injected that idea into the management of this pandemic as well, where they tried to, control everything and save the world. And in the process, they made a real hash of it.
Saskatchewan has finally come around. They're going to drop the mandates, all mandates, by the end of February. Here in Ontario, our premier is doubling and tripling down, much like the vaccine. If you were sitting around the science table and, just spending 15 minutes with me, it's very clear to me, a cattle rancher and an author, you have far more common sense than any of the people sitting around the science table. What would you advise the premier to do at this point?
They have to drop everything. I mean, ultimately, Section 1 of our Constitution says you cannot take away people's rights without, an actual in front of a court weighing of the evidence to justify it. And that's never been done. So from a legal standpoint, this all just needs to collapse instantly. But as far as from a management point of view, like the rest of us need to go about our lives, and the folks that are vulnerable need to voluntarily, based on their own assessment of risks and priorities, be advised to shelter at home until these waves last, 6 to 8 weeks at most. Things are already starting to come down here now with Omicron. Like, let them know, stay away from folks for a few more weeks, and then we can all go back to our lives. And so that, the focus needs to be protecting that small percentage of the population that really is vulnerable, because we know who they are. I mean, they have an outsized, 1,000 times more risk than the rest of us. They need to be, and many of them are already in a nursing home behind a wall. Like, you just have to close the doors. In many cases, like in previous flu waves, you actually have the option of having the caregivers that are there live inside the nursing home so that the doors just do not open. So that's how, they already have a lockdown that's permanently in place that really is enforceable by closing the door and leaving it closed. So I think that's the point that has been missed by our health authorities that have managed us instead of the vulnerable.
Cattle ranchers and truckers, if only you could run this country. Conversation with Julius Rochelle after these. Julius Rochelle is the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic. I'm dubbing you the philosopher cowboy. I hope you're okay with that.
Sure.
Are you still an organic beef farmer?
No, I've been writing about it since I left the industry, but I've been managing a website where I've been teaching pasture-focused cattle farming.
Ah, okay. So it's interesting that you bring this up, because we had the announcement from Premier Jason Kenney and Scott Moe and others that they are winding down the mandates. They always talk about, a path to ending the mandates and a plan to end the mandates. And now, at least, they're ditching the mask mandates in Alberta, Saskatchewan. But as you say, they are also normalizing, their emergency powers and government overreach. Talk to me about that.
Well, one of in a democracy, the basic democracy, basically the 90% can vote the 10% into slavery. But the difference between a democracy and a liberal democracy is that the individual rights of citizens are placed above the authority of government, so that they are not negotiable by policies and public health officials. They essentially provide a hard limit as to what government can do to people without their consent. And so by normalizing that there's some kind of path back to normal, we're actually normalizing that this was okay for the government to suspend our constitutional rights for 2 years, despite the fact that constitutional rights have to be unconditional in order for democracy to function.
In fact, I believe Quebec Premier Legault, said that he will get rid of the mandates on one condition, and that is he wants those powers to remain.
That's
so
right.
That it would be, in fact, much easier for him to invoke some sort of emergency power.
Very much so. See, that's the thing, is that there's beyond the fact that the individual rights are essential for us each individually to manage all the risks that are in our own life that go beyond COVID, which we've all experienced that now, where we haven't had that opportunity for 2 years to manage anything in our life, and where somebody can take away our right, our access to our life. But the other part of it too is that if someone has the right to tell you that you have to follow these mandates that violate your civil liberties. They can settle the debate with a mandate instead of trying to talk to you, instead of being transparent with the data and being forced to confront their critics. And so I think that's like when the mandates rolled out in March of 2020, at that point, we saw all the debate and all the transparency that's supposed to be at the heart of our democracy, like, just essentially evaporate. All of a sudden, the politicians, they could allow you to speak in a corner somewhere, but they could still force you to do something. So they haven't actually been forced to face their critics and be transparent about the data that they're working off of. And the same thing goes for the scientific institutions. Like the moment that you make rights conditional, the public health authorities and the scientists haven't had to face any of the critics that are pointing out mistakes that these people are making. So individual rights are actually the cornerstone of a functioning democracy that forces everybody that participates in the system to be transparent and to engage with critics. Like it prevents people from hiding in an echo chamber because all of a sudden they have to talk to those people that don't agree with them if they want them to play along with their rules.
Have you heard anything from any of the premiers when they were announcing the end to these mandates to suggest that they were also willing to give up these emergency powers?
Well, each one of them is talking about, either Omicron is mild, or they talk about the fact that, maybe the benefits outweigh the risks. And so they're kind of legitimizing that this is the path out of this. I mean, it's sort of like, when you legitimize that the majority can vote its way into somebody's life, it's sort of like saying, well, if my liver, my kidney, my lungs, my pancreas, etc., if I can save 6 people, then it's justified for me to be put on the operating table and have them all extracted because there's a greater benefit to society. So that's kind of the legal principle that's actually being normalized here, is that as long as the opinion poll or the technocrats and the elites say that it's reasonable, they can essentially do this to us unlimited at any time.
JuliusRuchel.com, JuliusRuchel.com. JuliusRuchel.com. His latest article is a good one, and he's also the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic. And he writes in his latest article, again, liberal democracy was built around the principle that individual rights must be unconditional. In other words, they are meant to supersede the authority of government. Consequently, individual rights, such as bodily autonomy, were meant to serve as checks and balances on government power. They were meant to provide a hard limit to what our governments can do to us without our individual consent. If the government cannot override your rights to bend you to its will, then it will be forced to try to convince you by talking with you. That forces governments to be transparent and to engage in meaningful debate with critics. Your ability to say no and to have your choice respected is the difference between a functioning liberal democracy and authoritarian regime. So it would appear, Julius, that we have lost our checks and balances. Is that because our charter has proven to be practically worthless?
Yeah, it's remarkable the way that the courts and the politicians have essentially thrown out all the principles at the heart of the charter. I mean, they're finding ways to reinterpret the words in order to legitimize this, but the principles at the heart of it are just being steamrolled left, right, and center.
So, what is the problem? Is it what I call the weenie clause, Section 1?
I think that's part of it. Although the weenie, like the Section 1, the weenie clause, yeah, it's meant to have all sorts of, like it's called the Oak test, where in order to be able to temporarily restrict some of our rights for some kind of emergency, there needs to be a public weighing of all of the evidence to show that it's overwhelmingly in the favor of limiting the rights. And I mean, like the Oaks test is what it's called, and it's like a very burdensome process that was never done. So, I mean, technically, every single one of these mandates is illegal because they overruled the protections that are even in that Section 1 that allows us as citizens to hold the government up to the light and say, okay, before you take our rights, show us the evidence that this is worthwhile. It's not up to the courts to simply decide that because the WHO says that it's this way, that it's okay to do this. It's not.
So how do we prevent this madness from happening again? Do we need to revisit the charter and, I don't know, get rid of the Section 1, or is it the fault of activist judges? How do we prevent this?
I think that I mean, even the United States has, they don't have a Section 1, and yet they still did the same thing. And so I think this is where the reality is that the public respect for the principles that are at the heart of our institution is what forces courts to rule in favor of our rights, so that if the courts are caught up in, like, if the judges are caught up in this hysteria, they are also going to end up succumbing to it and finding ways to interpret it away. And so it really is a battle for the hearts and minds of our citizens as a whole, to understand just how important it is to respect these kinds of individual rights if we want our democracy to continue to function. So, like, we have to make the hard choices where we have to go against our impulses to try to control our neighbors in order to maintain those checks and balances that keep us from going down these dark paths.
Seems like we need serious civics courses in school. I mean, I know they have civics courses, but I don't know if they really instill in young people, what a liberal democracy, a functioning liberal democracy means. And how we have to freedom is hard work. And we've just sort of let it slide because we've had it too easy. Is the remedy then only to be found perhaps at the ballot box? And we have to insist on electing provincial and federal governments and hold their feet to the fire and make them promise to get rid of these emergency powers.
I think that's one of the solutions, but I think it goes beyond that, that it really has to be that the public demands this as we have to stick to these principles in everything that we do. Because if we wait until the ballot box comes along, we're back in a situation where, if the wrong party gets elected, then all of a sudden our rights are at risk. And so it actually makes it very difficult for anyone to accept the outcome of an election if your rights can be steamrolled by a party that you disagree with. The only way that a democracy works is that no matter who gets in power, they don't have the right to step over the line of steamrolling the individual. So I think that we have a public relations battle to win on the ground level before we even get to the remedies that come through the courts and through the ballot box.
In other words, Julius, we need to change the culture. I mean, that is a long process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what's been interesting about what's going on with the truckers, is that it's bringing these conversations to the forefront and accelerating that on a big way. Whether somebody's right not to hear honking outweighs being able to take away access to somebody else's life because they disagree with the government about a vaccination or about a face mask. So I think this is sort of accelerating that cultural evolution that needs to happen.
Great article, Julius. Thank you so much. I hope you'll join us again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
JuliusRuschel.com. Julius, Julius, Ruschel, Ruechel, Ruechel, JuliusRuschel.com. He's also the author of Autopsy of a Pandemic.
Question everything. Seeing what falls. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
All right, welcome back. Coming up next week on the program, Whitley Strieber will be here. I'm not sure why I'm getting an echo again. However, Whitley Strieber will be here in hour one. He's a long-time alien contactee, abductee. Also co-wrote the book with Art Bell that became, what is that movie? The Day After Tomorrow? I believe Whitley Strieber, that's the one, yeah. He co-wrote that with Art Bell. All right, this is disturbing. An embalmer has been alarmed by mysterious blood clots in vaccinated people. Amid indications from many different sources of a dramatic rise in the sudden onset of serious illnesses following COVID-19 vaccination, a veteran embalmer, this is in the U.S., a veteran embalmer is reporting that he and more than a dozen colleagues in the industry have been noticing strange blood clots in most of their cases. Richard Hirschman, with more than 20 years of experience in the funeral industry in Alabama, says that in mid-2021, he began noticing odd blood clots in arteries and lungs he had never seen before. In an interview with Stephen Kirsch, Hirschman said that last month he found that 65% of his cases exhibited the clots. He told Kirsch that every one of the 15 people in the industry with whom he has spoken have observed the same alarming trend. So this interview with Stephen Kirsch. Kirsch is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who's applied his skills in data analysis to the pandemic, and he's formed a group called the Vaccine Safety Research Foundation, and he serves as the executive director. So now I guess he's got maybe a YouTube channel, and he's interviewing people, one of whom is this Richard Hirschman, an embalmer, 20 years experience in the funeral industry. Hirschman said that with only one exception, he hasn't seen any cases in which the strange clots were seen in an unvaccinated person. The exception was an unvaccinated person who had received a transfusion. Kirsch notes the Center for Disease Control and Prevention contends that nobody has died from the COVID vaccines. But overall, Hirschman has seen the strange blood clots in more than 50% of his cases. And in January, 37 of his 57 cases, 65%, had the suspicious clots. Hirschman said that 15 peers with whom he had discussed the issue see the same phenomenon but won't speak out publicly. PolitiFact challenged Hirschman's belief that the blood clots are caused by the vaccines. Fact checker Nassim Ferdowsi, who has no medical experience, said she was told by an embalmer in Phoenix, Arizona, that dark clots have been found in COVID victims long before vaccinations were available. However, the clots Hirschman is observing are white fibrous material. And Kirsch pointed out that the number of COVID deaths in Houston County, Alabama, where Richard works, is minuscule. In January, for example, there were 9 recorded COVID deaths in the county, but Hirschman had 37 cases that month with the clots. If these clots were caused by COVID, it's highly likely someone would have spotted it before 2021 and done a similar video, Kirsch wrote. There you go. An embalmer alarmed by mysterious blood clots in vaccinated people. All right. I mentioned next week on the program, Whitley Strieber will be here. Someone else I'm working on. He's been with us before. U.S. Attorney John O'Connor. And John O'Connor was Deep Throat's lawyer. Deep Throat from Watergate, who was later identified as Mark Felt. And John O'Connor would later go on to represent Felt towards the end of his life and his family. So O'Connor, I want to get him on to talk about this. This is not getting any play in the mainstream media, not surprisingly. Special Counsel John Durham, remember him? Yeah, you probably had forgotten. He's still around, still keeping his head down, doing his knitting, I suppose, if I can mix some metaphors, trying to piece together this whole Russian collusion fraud and who was behind it. And Durham says he's building a case to show the technology executive with whom an indicted Democratic lawyer on the payroll of Hillary Clinton's campaign was working to build a Trump-Russia collusion narrative, and they gained access to internet traffic at the White House to try and obtain dirt on former President Donald Trump. So left-wing lawyer Michael Sussman who was indicted last year for allegedly concealing his clients, among them Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, from the FBI, when he volunteered, since debunked claims of a secret back channel between the Trump organization and Russia's Alpha Bank. Remember that? And Trump went on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. It said, the Clinton campaign is spying on me. And Leslie Stahl, deny. There's no evidence. Stop saying it. You can't say that. Durham revealed in a Friday court filing that he has evidence that Sussman's other client, dubbed Technology Executive 1, but known to be former New Star Senior Vice President Rodney Joffe, exploited domain name system internet traffic at a particular healthcare provider, which was likely Spectrum Health, Trump Tower, Trump Central Park West apartment building, and the executive office of the President of the United States. Okay, so Michael Sussman, among his clients was the Clinton campaign, the 2016 Clinton campaign. Sussman hired, according to Durham, or if I'm following this narrative correctly, Sussman, who has been indicted, Sussman, who was the one that volunteered this now debunked claim of Trump and his organization and Russia's Alpha Bank. That started the whole collusion thing. So Sussman hired Rodney Joffe, and they hacked into internet traffic at Trump Tower. The revelations made as part of a motion for the Washington, D.C. federal court to look into possible conflicts of interest related to Sussman's defense team gave allies of Trump more reason to believe the former president was spied upon, as evidenced by an upsurge in tweets about the latest salve in the so-called Russiagate scandal. They didn't just spy on Donald Trump's campaign. They spied on Donald Trump as sitting president of the United States. It was all even worse than we thought, tweeted Mark Meadows, former congressman who later became Trump's White House chief of staff. Kash Patel, an intelligence and defense official in the Trump administration and chief Russiagate investigator under then House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes, said the filing shows that the Hillary Clinton campaign directly funded and ordered its lawyers at Perkins Coie to orchestrate a criminal enterprise to fabricate a connection between President Trump and Russia. Bingo. Mic drop. This is huge. I mean, many of us long suspected this, but Durham is finally starting to untangle this impossible Gordian knot. This is a huge story, and the mainstream media, it's radioactive as far as they're concerned. They're not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. But I will get John O'Connor on the program next week to discuss. Durham said that internet company One accessed dedicated servers for the EOP as part of a sensitive arrangement whereby it provides DNS resolution services to the EOP, and that Joffe and his associates exploited this arrangement by mining the EOP's DNS traffic and other data for the purpose of gathering derogatory information about Donald Trump. Joffe alerted Sussman about the Alpha Bank claims by July 2016. Durham said last year, and over the ensuing weeks, and as part of their lawyer-client relationship, Sussman and Joffe engaged in efforts with Campaign Lawyer 1, identifiable as former Perkins Coie lawyer and Clinton campaign general counsel Mark Elias. Wow, this is heating up. This is getting good. All right, when we come back, David Redman, Alberta's former head of their emergency management agency, talks about how all the governments across Canada threw out their pandemic plans because of panic, and he calls it criminal negligence. That conversation is next.
The truth.
as you're staring up at the night sky. Ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Follow Richard on Twitter at Richard Syrett. For show information, visit the website strangeplanet.ca.
This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Welcome back. Every Canadian province, all 10 Canadian provinces, all 3 territories, had a perfectly fine pandemic preparedness plan in place before COVID, prior to 2020. Ontario had one going back to 2013. British Columbia 2014, Alberta 2014. I'm not sure when Manitoba's was enacted. Newfoundland going back to 2007, New Brunswick 2006, Nova Scotia 2013, Nunavut. How do they compare? These pandemic plans we had in place prior to COVID, how do they compare to our actual pandemic response today? David Redman is a retired Canadian military lieutenant colonel, the former head of the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, and a senior fellow at Frontier Center for Public Policy. David, welcome. How are you?
I'm outstanding. How about yourself?
We're all hanging in as best we can. When you were the head of the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, what was your responsibility?
As the head of an emergency management agency, you're responsible for looking at all hazards that might affect a province and for developing an intelligence system to monitor any and all hazards, and then to develop plans that will address each of the hazards that are applicable to your province or territory.
What led to all of these provinces suddenly enacting these pandemic plans? Was it in reaction to SARS from 2003?
No. What happens in every jurisdiction in Canada is, as I say, you monitor the hazards. So I was the head of EMA back in 2004, 2005. It's a regular and ongoing process. So, for instance, you see that the Alberta plan is dated 2014, but back in 2005, we did the update of the plan. So these emergency plans aren't just written and put on a shelf. They're updated every 10 years, normally by law. It depends on each province what's required. But in Alberta, they were revitalized at least every 10 years. So what happened back in 2005, we had just been through a series of events in the province, but there was a new document released by WHO in 2005, which was the Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions Guidelines. And that caused Alberta to want to review its existing pandemic influenza plan. So we wrote an updated version in 2005, which after I retired was then updated again in 2014. So it's a regular ongoing process. And the purpose of those plans is so that when you're actually hit, for instance, in this case by a pandemic, you have a pre-existing plan that you should draw out, look at the exact virus that's hit you, because these were generic for all types of viruses. Look at the specifics of the virus that you're encountering, and it allows you to then very quickly tailor the plan, release it to the public in a full written format, and then to actually implement that plan step by step. And with all that pre-work done, it allows you to do correct decision-making right from the start, but with a full governance task force.
Were these plans designed only to address things like public health and, let's say, health sector communications, outpatient care, immunization, or did they look at the society as a whole, the functioning of society as a whole?
Let me use the Alberta plan as an example, and you can make your own determination. There was 4 goals, overarching goals, the must-dos in the Alberta plan dated 2014. The first was to control the spread of the disease and reduce the illness by providing access to appropriate prevention measures, care, and treatment. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2, mitigate societal disruption in Alberta through ensuring the continuity of all critical services. Number 3, minimizing the adverse economic impacts of the virus. And number 4, supporting an effective and efficient use of all resources. I put it to you that we've done exactly the opposite and have not met one of those 4 goals because we obviously threw the plans away.
Prevention, we did nothing. Mitigate societal disruption, we did the exact opposite. Minimize economic impact, we did the exact opposite. That's a big fail. So the pandemic plan, as far as Alberta goes, I mean, some of the key elements here: prevention of a pandemic, mitigate social disruption, minimize economic impact. Let's just look at these first three. I mean, what happened between 2014, in your estimation, and 2020? Did they throw that one out the window and start from scratch? Was it the fog of war? Did they lost the thread? What happened, David?
I believe that in February and March of 2020, we knew exactly who was most at risk from COVID. It was our seniors over the age of 60 with severe and multiple comorbidities. In fact, we saw worldwide that 95% of all deaths up to the middle of March 2020 were in seniors with severe comorbidities. So instead of protecting our seniors, which should have been our number one aim, and not using non-pharmaceutical interventions, as had been clearly stated in our plans, we did exactly the opposite. And that was because our premiers took one look at what was happening in China and Italy, and they panicked. They forgot they had pre-written plans or chose to ignore them and place the medical officers of health in charge. You should never do that. The medical officer of health had one task and one task only, which was to try and run a proper healthcare system. And our aim in March of 2020, instead of being to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on the province, became to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare system. A completely wrong aim. Putting the doctors in charge became the only aim.
As the former head of the Emergency Management Agency in Alberta, you must have been having fits when you saw the way Premier Kenney and other premiers were behaving through this pandemic. Did you have anyone's ear at that time?
I was completely dumbfounded by what they did. I gave them 2 weeks in March to dig their way out of the mistake they'd made by using non-pharmaceutical interventions for a type of virus that they had no effect on, other than extremely negative. And then I started writing. I wrote all 13 premiers. I wrote them 12 letters over 12 months, begging them to give me a 2-hour call, to step back from what they were doing, or to at least let another voice into their office to explain why the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions are A, not effective, but B, extremely deadly. And we've seen the results of that, tragically. But we knew that in September of 2019, who had just updated every 5 years the document on non-pharmaceutical interventions that we had first used back in 2005. It was very clear that for this type of virus, you should not use what we now call lockdowns, which is in fact a broad sweep of non-pharmaceutical interventions. So I begged them to try to stop and listen to somebody with a completely different point of view. When they ignored me for 12 straight months, and that's 13 out of 13 premiers, I wrote a position paper, which you can find on Frontier Center for Public Policy, which I published on the 1st of July, Canada's Deadly Response to COVID-19, in which I state that it is criminal negligence what we have done by our premiers, MOH, and the Prime Minister.
That was my next question. I was going to ask about criminal negligence. You know, we can excuse maybe, perhaps, some panic for the first couple weeks, but not after 22 months. So panic no longer explains it.
Absolutely correct.
I've been talking about a reckoning that must happen after all, when we finally crawl out from under this mess. There must be a reckoning. I don't know what you want to call it, a truth and reconciliation panel or criminal proceedings. I don't know. But what is the remedy after, I remember when after SARS and the doctor said, we learned so much from this, and the politicians, we learned so much. And when we first heard about SARS-CoV-2, they said, that's all right. We got this. We learned so much from SARS. They learned nothing, obviously. But what is your remedy after we finally get out from under this? What should be the reckoning?
It's going to take a while, because the first thing we need to do is walk back the fear. As an officer in the Army, and then as the head of EMA, I knew you never, ever use fear as a motivator in any type of emergency. And yet our politicians in MOH have used fear as the only tool in their toolbox. They have driven into the minds of all Canadians that, number one, lockdowns work. And they do exactly the opposite. They kill at least 10 times as many. In most studies, it's 100 times as many as any COVID deaths could ever have occurred. But number two, they also have inbred into Canadians that the only way out of this pandemic is with vaccines. Both those statements, lockdowns work and vaccines are the only way out, are two categorical mistruths. We need to walk back the mass formation, which has happened to our Canadian public, which is now more terrified of a disease, which for people under 60 is less risk than seasonal influenza. I'll say that again. For people under 60 without a severe comorbidities, this virus is less deadly than seasonal influenza, and Canadian statistics prove it, world statistics prove it, study after study after study. And yet, if you ask Canadians, they believe that COVID will kill them in a heartbeat if they don't lock down and if they don't wait for a vaccine to save them.
David, if there is ever, well, there will be, it's not a question of if, it's when. The next time it rolls around, if you're not too beaten down and frustrated, I pray that you or someone like-minded will be in charge of the pandemic response the next time. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
David Redman. All right, that's it for me. My thanks to Carlos Cagina and Ryan White. Back next week with Whitley Strieber. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.
Hey, 'tis the season to give the perfect gift. C60 Evo organic oil elixirs and facial serum sets. And here with another sleep tip is our good pal, Chris Burrows, co-founder and chief scientist at C60 Evo. Hey, Chris, welcome back.
Richard, thank you so much for having me. My next tip regarding getting better sleep is related to electronic devices. So we all have these, this cell phone lying around, or we're using it on a regular basis. What a lot of people don't realize is that those devices give off blue light. That blue light is actually tells our bodies, the only time naturally that we see blue light is at the peak of the sun. So when the sun is up at its peak at noon. And so what those devices do, including your computer terminals, your cell phones, your tablets, is they convince our physiology that it's the middle of the day. You can imagine that if you're watching your cell phone or tablet at 10 p.m. and you've somehow convinced your physiology that it's the middle of the day, this is not good for sleep. So it's really important. Most devices have actually blue light blockers, and you can just go out and Google and how to blue light block on my Samsung device or Apple device. Or even on your PC or your Mac. Make sure you turn that on. I know people who leave it on all day so that they're never impacted by that blue light. I would recommend 2 hours before the sun is setting in your local area to turn that on. Obviously, it doesn't work if you're working on videos or you're working on pictures, but try and turn that on 2 hours early. And the other thing regarding electronic devices, try to keep them out of the bedroom. I recommend that you actually put a charging station outside of your bedroom so that you just don't even bring it in your bedroom. These devices, as we've kind of been reading and hearing, are like geared to trigger our endorphin responses, and so we like to be on them. They keep them up, so keep it out of the bedroom and make sure you got your blue light blocker on about 2 hours before the sun sets. And I always like sharing sleep tips because our most consistent testimonial for our product is that people take it in the morning, they report mental focus and energy during the day, and then better sleep that night.
C60 Evo products deliver noticeable benefits to people and pets around the world. Immunity boost, deeper sleep, just like Chris said, more energy, mental balance, flexibility, and longevity. please visit the website c60evo.com/Richard-Sarrett. And don't forget, use the coupon code EVRS at checkout, EVRS at checkout, and then you save an extra 10%. That can't wait. All right, Chris, we'll talk again next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
A new Richard Sarrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.